through life or take many bizarre expressive forms. And he introduced me to a literature on what's called the clinician's fallacy. The clinician being the practicing psychiatrist who sees patients all the time. And this method is to note cases of a similar kind and note common characteristics such as the imposter or the buried trauma victim, and then to formulate these common characteristics into this typology, which becomes then described almost as a law of nature. And this is the way Moraine does it. He says, to sort of sustain his interpretation, he says, he keeps referring to, this is what always happens to trauma victims. Well, what Peter Jensen pointed out to me is that more scientific or statistically oriented psychiatrists and psychologists do is to not just look at those whose lives are damaged, but to look at all trauma victims, all children who've passed through a horrid experience. And the fact of the matter is, some of them are damaged, others survive, flourish, and rise up to live quite normal and ordinary lives. So you cannot predict solely on the basis of a trauma that a child will be damaged forever. It doesn't always work that way. You have to follow the whole life course. And that's the problem with looking at these things psychologically, is we're too much inclined, because of our psychological bent, to turn whatever subject we're working on into patients. We want to make them fit into our medical categories, and so we stress all their symptoms, all their agonies, and we often overlook the strengths of the subjects and their ability to overcome devastating experiences. So that's one reason why I'm uneasy about taking William Moraine and actually these others quite too seriously. My second approach, my second reason for doubting them or questioning them builds on what I've just said. And here I rely on the work of Erik Erikson, a name that 30 or 40 years ago everyone in the room would know, probably half of you do now. Erikson is the famous German psychoanalyst who came to America and had an illustrious career here as a therapist, but also as an intellectual and as a historian, his most famous book being Young Man Luther, that attempted to explain Luther's theology and his life and his religion and all of his experiences in psychoanalytic terms. Erikson, whom I studied with for a year and a half, so I got to know him and his work pretty well, was an ego psychologist. And what that meant in those times was that he accepted the basic Freudian structural system of the superego, the ego, and the id being the deep passions, the superego, the conscience or the monitor, and the ego being the I, the conscious self that's trying to hold a life together. And what Erikson felt had been the error of psychoanalysis up to that time was to underestimate the powers of the ego. Psychoanalysts, beginning with Freud, had seen the id and the superego as too cruel or unbounded forces that just crushed the ego, and life was just sort of a constant struggle to ride this bucking bronco that your psyche truly was. Erikson looked at the ego and its strengths and its powers to mediate between the internal psychic forces. And he came to admire the courage and the ingenuity and the strength of people in managing all the things that their culture and their upbringing had thrust upon them and that were incorporated into their personalities. He thought people were extraordinarily resourceful in making lives for themselves, despite the damage that had been done to them. In fact, his theory of eminent leadership, which moved from Luther to Gandhi, was that the great men, the truly influential men, are those who had suffered from precisely the psychic illnesses of their time, confronted those problems, and dealt with them. So my reply to Vogel, claiming that the Smiths were a dysfunctional family, is that they did indeed suffer from a father who failed to provide and who turned to alcohol and treasure-seeking, and a mother who was under stress, and poverty that was debilitating, and disease. These were the ailments of poor rural farmers everywhere. Furthermore, I would add to his list the one that I think is most powerful, and that was the ongoing insult of class. It's equivalent to the ongoing insult of race, that those who are poor are continually thought to be inferior or incompetent in some way, degraded even. And the insult of class is everywhere in the Hurlbut affidavits. The Smiths are condemned for their poverty. They're considered to be lazy, and a whole set of insults that were directed at all poor rural farmers in those days. And the Smiths had to live their lives under almost constant conditions of humiliation. So you put all those things together and you have a Joseph who did indeed pass through many sorrows, many agonies, many rages, I'm sure. But the very fact that he confronted all of those and dealt with them and rose above them was a source of confidence to those who know them. And what is most significant, I believe, in this is that Joseph Smith invested plain people like themselves with dignity, self-respect, and hope. If there was ever a theology that gave hope and the promise of greatness to those who had suffered humiliation through their lives, it was the theology that Joseph Smith presented. So those are my responses to the psychological attack. I call them attacks on Joseph because I sense they are just that. They are attempts not just to understand him, but to discredit him. Which brings me then to, I guess I'm doing all right on time, to the third question, and that is the problem of women. The problem is that women were not officially involved in the church for the first decade. They were certainly important, as women always are. Emma was probably the most influential person in Joseph Smith's life. I had the feeling he talked about almost everything with her. Polygamy was probably the exception, but my guess is he talked to her about that at first, early on, too. But she was the one who went to the hill with him. She helped translate. She confirmed his faith with her belief. She was a believer in Joseph's revelations. And she consoled him. And I don't want to underestimate that. She was called, it was almost an official call to console him. Console and consolation are two of the largest words in Joseph Smith's vocabulary. He needed consoling. He was a melancholy person who needed to be upheld. And Emma did all that for him. So Joseph never demeaned her or any women that I know about. Emma was told to expound and exhort, to write and learn. And so she's a woman who is highly honored. But neither she nor the other women had any official position in the church. No priesthood, no missionary service, no preaching, no administrative authority. Some of them may have been present at councils and conferences, but they